Why did the U.S. invade Iraq?
Well, the U.S. invaded Iraq because Iraq had invaded the neighboring country of Kuwait, a little bit similar to the way Russia's invaded the Ukraine. Iraq and Kuwait were under like a similar rule before World War One, and Saddam Hussein always felt like Iraq should have control of Kuwait, and then later, after the Iraq-Iran war, Iraq really needed to sort of pay off its debts, and it was having a hard time doing it because Kuwait and the UAE and a few other countries were producing oil at a rate that lowered the price, which made it hard for Iraq to pay back its debts. Um, and they also thought that Kuwait and Iraq share some oil reserves, and Iraq felt that Kuwait was um, taking more than their share, or essentially taking oil from Iraq's oil reserves. And so um, Saddam entered Kuwait, and Kuwait was an important country for oil, but also for stability in the Middle East and a bit of a buffer to Saudi Arabia, who was our primary ally in the Middle East at the time. And Saudi Arabia was concerned that Iraq was not going to stop in Kuwait. It would actually come and take part of Saudi Arabia. And actually, during the war, they did have incursions into Saudi Arabia. And so the United States and Great Britain um, placed troops in Saudi Arabia as a deterrent. And over the years, I don't know if it's the biggest, but over the years, the United States and the UK amassed a huge coalition of countries that were aligned against Iraq, like a lot of, like all of NATO, of course NATO, but a lot of countries like, I don't know, and they essentially told Kuwait, they gave them a deadline by which they had to leave Kuwait, and Iraq missed that deadline, and Iraq tried to kind of make a broader war to get the other Arab states on their side by attacking Israel, which is like a common enemy of the other Arab states, since they tried to draw other people into the war, but it didn't work. Um, so that's why um, the U.S. invaded Iraq after over a year of trying to get them to agree to leave Kuwait.
Mm. How did the U.S. people support the U.S. going into?
I think largely different than it is today. Um, the U.S. population was very supportive of the war because desiring stability in the Middle East and the fairly obvious kind of incursion into Kuwait, it was easy to say this is wrong. It wasn't a difficult concept to understand of why, just like Russia going into Ukraine now, like, and the one thing that's weird about the war, I don't know if this is useful to you or not, but it was like the first war. It was kind of where like cable news was born, because it was the first war where they were reporting on it real time, like live, 24 hours a day. And so people got really invested in it because it was the first time they could actually watch it happening, like literally happening. So I think that brought people with a certain, like, a common understanding or exposure to the war that didn't seem to be the norm. You get real time understanding what was going on, and since the war largely went in the U.S.'s and the coalition's favor, it didn't really fall out of favor with the U.S. because we didn't have a lot of um, casualties. It was a pretty overwhelming sort of defeat, even though I don't know the actual numbers, but Iraq had a significant army because they've been fighting with Iran for decades, and so they had like one of the biggest air forces. So they weren't just a small country. they had a significant army and air force and people that actually were in battle, so they had experience. But the U.S. plus the U.K. plus all the other countries combined were just kind of overwhelming force. There's no country really could stand up to that.
How did the war end?
The war ended after, first there was a kind of a prolonged air campaign where they knocked out the Iraqi air defenses. And it was like the first time we actually used, I know that we used stealth bombers and drones in a major battle, and those really made it lopsided in the Americans' favor. And so once we took out their air defenses, like we used to watch at night on CNN where like it looked like fireworks over Baghdad. They used to say like Baghdad was the best guarded city in the world, and so like every night it just looked like they were shooting fireworks there because they couldn't see the stealth bombers, so they just literally shot in the air, and so like the whole city was covered in anti-aircraft fire all night. And since the time zone is off by 13 hours, you would see what was happening at night during the day here. So like you could watch it, what was happening in real time. Since most of the battles were happening at night, anyway, that happened. Then there's after we softened it up, we did a massive ground offensive, and pretty much Iraq forces had to go retreat. And then so for quite a long time, we thought that we didn't go into Baghdad because we thought that the Kurds or other factions in Iraq would take out Saddam Hussein for us. But didn't happen. He was pretty powerful within the country, pretty ruthless. So he stayed in power, and we ended up negotiating essentially the end of the war with him. And part of what we negotiated was that they had to give up weapons of mass destruction programs, and they had to essentially reimburse or pay back monies to Kuwait and other countries affected. But the biggest thing was essentially not being able to, have chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, no nuclear program. Kind of the same way, put restrictions on Iran now. But that's how it ended. And so, it was kind of, a lot of people thought that the shit went into Baghdad and took Saddam Hussein out, or take him out of power. They would have been better, because they tried to, like the first night of the campaign, they bombed his palaces. It wasn't like they weren't trying not to remove him. They just weren't able to. And they eventually found him hiding in a hole in some remote compound, and then the Iraqi people, the new government, tried him, and he was hung.
How did people feel? How did people feel about the leader staying in power, and how do you think that led up into the second Gulf War?
Well, I think people understood sort of why we didn't go into Baghdad, because going into Baghdad would have meant a lot of loss of life, and our stated interest was to sort of, we already damaged his military significantly, so the thought that he was going to threaten neighbors was not as much of a concern. And one of the main justifications for us doing this was essentially to get rid of his weapons of mass destruction. So those, there was inspectors that were allowed in, and that became just a constant struggle. So people were really frustrated with him not complying or doing what he agreed to do. And so there's a lot of small little dust-ups or conflicts with Saddam over the years. And so a lot of people believe, and I personally believe, that 9/11 was used as an excuse to have more security in the Middle East, and to go in and finish what they wish they would have done in the first Gulf War, which is remove Saddam from power.
Mm-hmm. how do you think the relationship in between the Bush family, having his George Bush Sr. being the president during the first Gulf War, and George Bush being during 9/11, how do you think that affected like the outcome?
Well, people say that it was a personal vendetta between Saddam Hussein and the Bush family, and there's a general thought that history was used by more hawkish or people who wanted to go to war in the younger Bush's cabinet, because they were the same cabinet that his dad had, that they used the idea of like, this guy wanted to kill your father, and also, maybe without saying it, this is one of your father's biggest mistakes, not taking out Saddam Hussein, and you can essentially right the wrong and finish what your dad started. So it's true or not, but it's definitely, people definitely discussed it.
Right.